After the '64 election, it was between Lyndon Johnson and Barry Goldwater. Those were the two candidates, and obviously Lyndon Johnson won. After he won, Malcolm X basically said that, uh, and I'm paraphrasing. He said that black people had ran from the wolf into the jaws of the fox, and I think you can say that the same thing happened this past election with Trump and Biden. We basically ran from the wolf, who was Trump, into the jaws of the fox, Biden. So
But the fox this time is not only cute but really old. So like, how could it be dangerous, right? Like, I don't know.
Well,
Maybe it's just me.
we're talking about the author of the crime bill, after all.
Oh my
Um,
God,
yeah,
yeah.
so
yep,
Yeah, that only happened in '94.
yep.
But yeah, I mean, like that was when Clinton passed the crime bill, the three strikes mandatory minimum sentencing, the actual bill that made mass incarceration literally spike through the roof. And yeah, Biden definitely had a part in that.
Oh, he was the architect of the crime bill.
one thing I admired about his writing, just as a start, was just how it wasn't repetitive, but he would repeat an idea and expand on it like multiple times, and he would sort of like delve into it deeper every time he did. And he expresses this idea a couple times where he has more anger for the northern liberal than for the southern racist. That's just, adamant and open about it because the northern liberal will be hypocritical and pretend they're morally superior, but in reality they're just as bad, if not, worse than the southern racist. And I think that's important for our current moment because, I mean, speaking personally, as a leftist, my a lot of my anger is geared towards Democrats who do basically the same thing. They present themselves as morally superior to the Republicans, and yet all they do really is sort of cleanse their ideas into policies that are more acceptable to bourgeois white people. Um, so I thought that was one thing that Malcolm was super prescient on, and still has a lot of application today.
I definitely agree with Malcolm on self defense and reciprocity. In other words, if you do unto someone else what they do unto you, because many people parrot that they would be for nonviolence today. However, I defy anyone to tell me that nonviolence is something that they would readily sign up for if they were given the choice between it and self-defense. Because what people don't realize is that Martin Luther King, he went through a lot. He was imprisoned countless times. He had his head bashed in by the police. To put yourself on the front lines nonviolently, it does present a danger to yourself and to others. So for people who say that they would readily take up nonviolence, I challenge them to really process that in their head. Have they ever you know been in a similar situation as King was?
Yeah, it's
Uh,
really all about perspective. Because like if you look at it, like again, like he even goes over this in the speech, but you can only say, you can only be like a Christian that says turn the other cheek, so many times. But like it's like yeah, if you never have like a real reason to actually have to fight back about something that's like threatening your own safety and civil rights, it's so easy to say that. But then if you're looking at something like the plight of black people in the '60s, the same rule just doesn't apply because it's just a completely different lifestyles at this point, meaning like they're just like two people, it's like two people getting treated exactly the same opposite. So you can't really, if you're being abused and you're suffering from violence and inequity, you can't just be like, well, turn the other cheek. Like, what does that even mean in this case?
yep,
Like, should I just die? Like, what does that mean?
and to that point, if you study the civil rights movement, like nonviolence was very effective or very amenable to Black people in the South, but in the North, it wasn't something that Black people would readily accept because the conditions were way different in the North. Segregation wasn't. They didn't have de jure segregation by law. They had de facto segregation. So
Right. So like in the South, it was kind of like they already like knew their place, but in the North, people didn't really know what to do without that like protection, like as far as like the white communities went. Like they
Yeah.
didn't really know how to handle the integration at that point, and they really were no different. But but yeah, again, somehow they had the temerity to act like they were so different.
Yep. And when Dr. King, when he went north in I think it was 1966, when he went north to Chicago, he actually encountered more resistance there than as opposed to the South. Now, another thing with regards to Malcolm, you have to realize that Malcolm post Mecca or post Mecca, post Africa is an entirely different person.
Mm-hmm. Especially like the Mecca part, like completely. Oh, but yeah, because especially he was there, and like obviously, just because it's hard to realize outside of the context of America, but the fact that like whiteness is completely invented, and you go to Mecca, and there's just Muslim people of literally all skin colors, and he's like saying like, oh my God, look, I had a really good experience with a white person, like that didn't really mean anything. It's really like like in a lot of cases, it's highly contextualized to America.
And aside from that, Malcolm made two very important changes in Mecca. Number one, he amended his views on women, because when he was in the Nation of Islam, he took on he was basically a walking, talking manifestation of Elijah Muhammad's program. So he had very conservative takes on women. But when he went into Africa, he found that the countries where women held progressive roles were the countries that were best off. So where women's education was prioritized, those were the countries that had the most success relative to countries where women were treated as second-class citizens. And then,
definitely, yeah.
Yep. And then another important change he made was when he came back to the States from Mecca. He didn't renounce Black nationalism, but he did sort of move away from it, and he moved away from its capitalist implications. So
and also like, oh sorry, just I wanted to add to what you said, but also like he kind of stepped away from the extreme divisiveness of like the stance of Nation of Islam of like really being that like married to the idea of insisting that like white people were the devil. But again, I feel like this is really a matter of perspective, because I genuinely feel like a lot of the people that were part of Nation of Islam didn't really have that much of a perspective outside of what was happening in America. I mean, that you can only like see what you only have your own perspective.
Yeah.
I mean, again, that's the part I disagree with. But again, it's kind of like when you think about like everything that has happened, I feel like you can't really, like you don't really have the right to decide how people cope with what they're dealing with in a way. But again, like the amount of strength Malcolm shows in stepping away from that obviously says a lot.
And to your point, you were speaking about Malcolm after Mecca and after Africa. I think the most difficult thing to read in the autobiography for a white reader is the phrase white devil. And I think the biggest issue with that is just that he's speaking archetypally throughout the arc of history. He's not speaking about individual well-meaning white people. And I think towards the end, if I remember correctly, he makes the point that sure, well-meaning white people are, welcome to the movement, but your primary work is with other white people, convincing them to change their ways. You don't have to like just automatically, prove yourself to be one of the good ones, like by hanging around with other Black people all the time. Your more active role is with your own people and convincing them not to be the way they've been for hundreds of years, thousands of years. So I think that's important to point out, especially, as a white person reading this, if you are speaking to, white colleagues or whatever, talking about what you're reading, they might immediately be taken aback, like, oh, Malcolm X. Why are you reading Malcolm X? He's so extreme. And it's like, well, no, you just haven't read him. You don't know what he said. So I think that's our work moving forward.
Should social movements today have visible leaders like they did in the 60s? And I ask that because when Malcolm X was killed, his organization of Afro-American Unity, it fell apart within a few months of his assassination because it relied on his charisma. And the same can be said about Martin Luther King. the SCLC still exists, obviously, but it it lost the momentum it had when King was there. So my question is, uh, do social movements today need visible leaders like X or Malcolm or X and King?
I feel like it goes both ways because I feel like in order to really garner support, people really respond to having like a certain figurehead or leader to associate with what's going on. But the downside is again like A, an example of what you just said, or B, the person's life and the fact that they probably won't make it out alive. I guess it's a matter of like if you're willing to take that risk. But I don't know because I do feel like when you're able to associate a face to a movement, it has a lot more power just in public consciousness. I guess it's just the way humans respond to things.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about pack mentality, there's always been a leader, like, and that's just like you, like that's how human beings have evolved. And I think the problem is that even if you didn't have a leader, we would still somehow like psychologically attribute like one person with that group, and in our heads they would be the leader, if that makes sense. Like you always like establish like the face, and like if there's one person that's speaking more than the others, I think it's like humans' brains are just like, oh, that's the leader. And so like even I think it's really hard to like even establish like a non-leader group. Like so that's just what I think.
See, I think I'm different on this issue because I mean the world that Dr. King and Malcolm X were in was very different. I mean, just look at Twitter. I mean, not that Twitter is like great; it's got a lot of selectivism going on, but I think social media platforms that allow voices like that sort of allow movements to be more democratized. I don't think that there can be no organization or leadership, definitely not. But instead of there being figureheads which fall victim to like whether or not there's, biographical problems, like there's controversies that could hurt the movement, blah blah blah. Instead of that, I think you just need an abundance of community organizers, like, a democratized system where there are a ton of leaders who are organizing individual areas, um, and then just a cohesive movement nationally through like social media. Um, that's something that I don't think we've perfected by any means. I think there are problems associated with that too, just because when the movement is entirely democratized on social media like that, you're going to have people who are saying ridiculous things that are going to be, artificially pumped up, and that's going to make the movement look bad. But I think that's a smaller price to pay than, placing all your eggs in one basket and putting all the pressure on one leader who has to like be morally pure all the time, because otherwise it could hurt the movement if they like just make mistakes as all humans do. Um, but I'm curious what you guys think of that.
I agree with it. I think Black Lives Matter is following that very structure, a democratized structure. Um, with regards to the '60s, we also have to keep in mind that not only were civil rights leaders assassinated, they were also discredited. The FBI had their COINTELPRO uh, counterintelligence program, which was designed specifically to discredit Black leaders. And one of the methods that they used to precipitate the break between Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad was they sent Elijah Muhammad information that was meant to imply that Malcolm was going to kill him to take his seat as head of the Nation of Islam forcefully. So that's one of the things they actually used against him. And I think that uh, a democratized structure would eliminate the ability of the FBI or any state agency to or to easily discredit you know people who are who outwardly represent whatever movement they're a part of.